So, hello everyone. I welcome you to this interview. And today we have with us Lisa Sauermann, who is a research mathematician who has the third best performance in IMO history with 4 gold medals and 1 silver medal. And she also had the only perfect score in 2011. So, yeah, let's just get started with that. How was your IMO journey? Could you describe it?
So I went to the IMO 5 times and they were all great. I enjoyed every single IMO tremendously. As I guess all of you know, going to IMO is just a great experience. And fortunately, this year it might not be quite as great as it is in a normal year, but I'm really glad that the IMO is still offered virtually, which seems to be the best that's currently possible. But so concerning my IMO journey, it was always great to go to IMO and yeah, so I don't know exactly. Maybe the person who asked the question can ask for more clarification if they
Yeah, right. So, how did so you clearly have cracked the formula for gold medals, right? 4 gold medals. What's your formula for that? How did you prepare, and what was your strategy?
Yeah, I don't think there's a formula. So it's kind of the problems are hard every year, as all of you know, and there's obviously also a bit of luck involved. There's something like, oh, does one have the right idea in kind of this 4.5 exam hours of exam time, but also kind of does one get lucky with the problems. I mean, in the sense of, I guess most people are better at some areas than other areas. Everyone has their personal strengths and weaknesses. And then obviously it's also a matter of luck whether the problems fall into one's strength areas or weakness areas. So for example, for me, inequalities were my biggest weakness. And I got lucky that there was only one inequality in the 5 years I participated, which I also did not solve. So I think there's no magic formula, and but training obviously helps a lot. So I guess I just did a lot of past IMO problems or other Olympiad problems. I guess all of you know, on the internet one can find Olympiad problems from many countries, and so that's, I guess, how I prepared.
And so you said inequalities was your weakest subject.
Yes.
Which one was the strongest?
I think combinatorics and geometry were my strong subjects.
Okay, and did that influence what you did later in life?
That's a great question, and I don't actually know the answer. So when I finished high school, I went to undergraduate to the University of Bonn, and I just followed the normal undergraduate curriculum. I mean, it's not very fixed at Bonn. You have a lot of choices, but so I kind of got interested in algebra and kind of algebra in university is not the same as what they call algebra at the IMO. But so I got interested in algebra in the kind of actual sense and not the IMO sense. And I also started taking courses in algebraic geometry then towards the end of my undergraduate and found that very exciting. And so I then planned to kind of specialize in that direction, algebraic geometry. And it was only a few years later. So then I went to the US, to Stanford for the PhD program after my bachelor's at Bonn, and started doing algebraic geometry. Specializing more, taking more courses in algebraic geometry there. And then only in my second year of the PhD program, a new professor came to Stanford. His name was Jacob Fox, and he is he does combinatorics. And because I'd never taken combinatorics course in my undergrad, I thought, and I liked combinatorics so much at IMO, I felt like I would take his course. And I liked the course so much that I completely changed my mind on what I wanted to do. And so then I kind of changed my mind and decided to do combinatorics instead. And that's what I'm doing now. So I'm doing combinatorics now, but it was not a direct route that it was, oh, I like combinatorics at IMO, so that's why I'm going to keep doing combinatorics in university and research. So it was really not at all like that. And then geometry, I think, geometry at IMO is, as you all know, kind of elementary geometry, lines and circles and all these things on the plane. And geometry in the research sense is something completely different. And I don't think there's much connection between those two things at all. So I think geometry in the IMO is a beautiful area with wonderful problems, but it's not something that's useful ever again if you go into math research, I think.
I see. So why do you think we uh, do the kind of geometry that is done in the IMO? Do you think it's only for problem solving and critical thinking skills, or do you really find the techniques useful later as well?
So I don't think I've ever used a single thing that I learned kind of at the IMO or kind of in training for the IMO in the realm of elementary geometry ever later.
Okay.
Okay, maybe this is a bit of strong of a statement, but I think this is basically true. Maybe kind of some very kind of elementary things about the centroid of a triangle or something might come up because that's kind of the average of vectors. But apart from that, I don't think kind of any of what's kind of geometry in the IMO comes up in most people's math research. I mean, there are always exceptions and there's always someone who kind of maybe makes a very unusual connection, but I think it's mostly true that this is not showing up in research math. And as to why it's on the IMO, well, why not? I mean, it's a beautiful area, and the IMO in general is not, I mean, most areas of the IMO are not at all close to current math research. And that's not a bad thing or a problem, in my opinion, because if you, I mean, the problems that are studied in math research often require years and years and years of taking university courses to even understand the problem, right? So it's not realistic on a high school level to really kind of have problems that have to do with current research in certain abstract areas of math, like algebraic geometry or differential geometry and so on. So so since the IMO is a high school competition, it only makes sense to limit the problems to what is in the toolbox of high school. Now, obviously, high school is very different from country to country, and not everyone learns about elementary geometry actually when they go to their everyday school. But it's still something that's in the realm of what's learnable without kind of having to take years of courses. And so there's basically this toolbox of elementary things, like an elementary number theory, elementary geometry. And then IMO makes beautiful problems out of them. And I think that's great. And I mean, some people criticize IMO for saying, well, this is not actual math, it's just kind of tricks with these elementary tools. And I mean, it depends on what you say what math is. It's not kind of close to current math research. Okay. I think that's fair to say. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, right? It's just a competition in something which kind of talks about proofs, talks about mathematical arguments, and so on, but kind of limits the objects that are studied to something that is accessible with a high school student. And whether one likes to pursue this or not, that's a personal preference. And I know people who kind of, when they are in high school, say, well, I find this silly, I don't want to do math Olympiads, I'd rather already take university courses instead of wasting my time on Olympiad thing, as I'm rather gonna get started on my college education by taking courses in high school, and that's also a fair choice. Or, I mean, so it's a personal preference, but I don't think there is something wrong with doing IMO because I think, for me personally, it was a lot of fun, and I met wonderful people at all these IMOs, and I think the training the kind of problem-solving skills can actually be useful later if you decide to do math research. So.
Yeah, that was a great answer. What's your favorite thing about the IMO other than the maths itself?
Meeting the people.
Meeting the people. Do you have any?
Even better than the math itself.
Do you recall any interesting incidents or stories from your IMO days?
Oh, I mean, there's no particular story, a particular person I'm referring to, but it's just, I mean, going to IMO itself is great because you meet all these people from all these different countries and you share a common interest, but you also just have fun together. And it's, I guess, as you probably all know, or maybe not all of you know because a virtual IMO is different, but at least when I was at IMO, when people were hanging out in the evening together, they kind of didn't talk about math the whole time. People talked about all sorts of things, played fun games. It was just nice. It was just, very nice social interactions. And then I guess IMO is not just IMO itself, but okay, in some sense it is, but in many countries there's also preparations for the IMO, and at least in Germany they consist of a lot of training camps where one also meets very nice people, and I made a lot of friends that way, and those friendships stayed, and I think, so many of my friends that I have nowadays, not all of them of course, but many I met kind of 10 years ago at these IMO training camps. And so for me, that was certainly a wonderful thing to meet all these people.
That's really cool. So if the audience has any questions, I request you to put it in the chat, or better yet, just unmute yourself and ask. So I'll keep an eye out on the chat. Meanwhile, so what advice do you have for students who are currently preparing for the IMO?
Well, so kind of advice concerning what's kind of the best way to prepare, I think I think what's most helpful is to just do all IMO problems. But obviously, if you just kind of know nothing about math and you start reading IMO problems and try to solve them, that might not work so well. So you also need to obviously learn some tricks and kind of techniques and so on. And so then I guess it depends a little bit on your circumstances. So in Germany, we had a lot of camps where people were teaching us a lot of techniques and so on. And so I didn't really have to seek out how to find sources to learn these techniques. So I got lucky that way. And then what I did on my own was really just solving problems. But if you are from a country where you don't have these training resources, I think there exists a lot of wonderful resources in the internet. I'm not the biggest expert on recommending specific ones, given that I was in the fortunate situation to not have to seek them out myself. But I'm sure if you search the internet, you also find pages where people discuss where to find good materials. And I think there also exist some wonderful books. And so the book I used most was the IMO compendium with all the problems, but that's obviously just problems, and those you can also find online. So you no need to buy the book if you don't happen to kind of have someone who offers it as a present to you or something. So I think to keep the short answer is, well, you need to learn techniques and tricks, but also solve a lot of problems on your own. And then I guess it's sometimes not clear what the right balance of these things is.
Right. So Luke asks, do you keep up with the current IMO questions, and do you try to solve them now?
No, actually, I haven't even looked at the ones from the last 2 days. I don't know whether they're online. I used to, and I was also a coordinator at, I think, IMO maybe 2014 to 2016, at which point I obviously was keeping up with what was going on. But I have a child now, so my daughter was born 2 years ago. So since then, I haven't found time anymore to keep up, unfortunately. But hopefully once things get a bit more calm and my daughter doesn't need to be, becomes a bit more independent, hopefully I find time again to read and think about the IMO problems when they come out.
Right. So can you tell us more about what you did after IMO and how was your transition into research mathematics?
Yes, so after I finished high school, I went to undergraduate at the University of Bonn in Germany. That was, well, I considered going abroad, but that was all expensive, and in Bonn it was free, no tuition, and all my friends from the IMO camps were going there. So it was a natural choice to go, and I very much enjoyed it there. So I had a good time, and I think I got a good undergraduate education. So then I guess in undergraduate, I guess the question was a bit more about how the transition to doing research. So in undergraduate, at least in Germany, one doesn't typically do much research. One takes courses and learns a lot of material. And then I went for the PhD program in Stanford in California in the US. So in the US, it's common to start the PhD program right after the bachelor. So it's not common to do a master's first. So I went there, and there kind of in the first year, it's still a lot of courses, and then also some qualifying exams where they check your background in different areas of math and so on. And then it was time to transition to research. And so I guess I already said that I first kind of thought I would be doing algebraic geometry, but then I changed my mind. So then I changed into combinatorics. And so then it was maybe in my second year of the PhD program that I started to transition to doing research. And the transition was not easy for me because the research problem does take much longer than an IMO problem, as you can probably all imagine. Right? At IMO, you have 4.5 hours only, and you are supposed to do, well, up to 3 problems, whereas in a research problem, you're supposed to spend much more than 4.5 hours on the problem. It can be 4.5 months, it can be much longer than that. So it's obviously very different. And then I guess the transition to research, I guess it's a very individual thing. But for me, there's also obviously, similar to as there's an IMO, also for research, sometimes a bit of luck. In the sense, like you try a project and it might work out well or it might not. You don't always know in advance. It also depends on the field, but at least in combinatorics, at least the way kind of my advisor was working, he didn't suggest problems where he would already know how to solve them, because that would be besides the point. So he wouldn't know how to solve them either. So that means that it's not clear how hard the problem actually is. So it might be basically unsolvable, totally out of reach, or it might be a very reasonable first project for a PhD student. And there's a bit of luck, and so there's quite some variance of time, how long it takes until one kind of makes progress on one's first project. And for me, it took about a year, and it was difficult because I started losing hope that I was good at this, because I thought, well, okay, I was good at, but research is obviously something different. Maybe I'm just not made for this. But then it worked out, and so then I wrote a bunch of papers, and I think things are going well with research now. But yeah, so I guess the moral of that story is just that I think IMO is very different from research, and one shouldn't be expecting to be fast at research just because one is fast at IMO, which I don't think I was expecting, but I guess it can be, it can be hard if it takes you a long time until you start making progress on research. But I think it's good not to lose hope.
We're very glad it worked out in the end. So Francisco asks, did you ever get a really bad grade on these Olympiads? And if so, how did you recover from it? What did you learn? How did you keep your motivation?
Yeah, so on IMO itself, I don't think I ever got a really bad grade. But in Germany, there are these selection exams. So I think we have 7 exams each year for actually selecting for IMO, and then 2 pre-selection exams where the people are selected to go to the selection camp. So it's basically 9 exams in total. And I don't remember any specific one, but I'm sure that there were some where I felt like I wasn't doing so well, and I solved only 1 problem, maybe many people had 2. But if you add up over 7 exams, obviously it's okay to kind of not do so well on one of them. But yeah, so how did I recover? Well, obviously it's always frustrating, but I guess it's best to just accept the fact that things can't always go well, right? You can't, sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you have a bad day, sometimes you get lucky with a problem, sometimes you get unlucky. And I guess I don't have a good advice on how to become more resilient with this, but yeah.
Okay. So Freddie asks, where do you find your research problems? How do you come up with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the wonderful thing when one is a PhD student is that one usually has an advisor who helps with that. So, but now I'm not a PhD student anymore. It's hard to find good research problems. And I think one of the reasons why kind of PhD programs are so long and you have so many years of having an advisor helping you with this is because it's a hard skill to learn. And it's also very field dependent. So I think if I say something now, you should not think that this applies to all of math. I mean, it only applies to my specific field, so which is combinatorics, or more specifically extreme combinatorics. Yeah, but so in my field, one way to find problems is to look at papers, especially, so either old papers, but then the conjectures are old, and so that means that they haven't been solved in a while, means that they're probably hard. But then it's particularly exciting if you make progress on them. Another way is to look at newer papers where people kind of came up with some problems or maybe some progress towards one of the older conjectures, and then maybe one can take the ideas and add more ideas and make more progress. Or another way is, which is I think a great way to come up with problems, is to talk with people, because kind of everyone has kind of different things they have on their mind, and then discussing math with people is in general, I think, a wonderful thing and leads to a lot of progress, both in coming up with project ideas, but also and research problems to kind of attack, but also, and even more so, I think, for making progress on those problems. So I've had plenty of instances where kind of I had a collaborator and I each had half of the ideas, and I don't think either of us would have been able to kind of write the whole paper and have all the ideas, but together kind of we managed. And so I think there are plenty of examples of this, and it's also, at least for some people, much more fun to work together with other people.
So for you, what's the divide like between actual problem solving and just reading through literature?
You mean in research?
In research, yes.
You mean time-wise, the divide?
Yes.
Okay. I don't do much reading. I should probably do more, but yeah, I think it would be better if I read more, but I don't spend that much time reading. So I usually only read papers in detail when I feel like they're relevant for one of the projects I'm working on. It would be better to read more papers in general, just for kind of education, for getting more breadth, knowing more techniques, just independent of what the problems one is thinking about. But obviously that takes a lot of time, especially reading a math paper in detail. Right? I mean, skimming the introduction, that's quick, but reading it in detail with all the steps, that takes a lot of time. And especially now that I have a child, I used to do much more reading before having a child, but now that I have a child, I guess I'm much shorter on time, and so I currently prioritize more to make progress on actual research projects. And hopefully once I have more time, I will also get back to doing more reading.
Okay. So yeah, there's also a question which says, do you try to deal with the millennium problems? Do you think about those?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay. So yeah, your Wikipedia page says you presented a new mathematical theorem as early as in your 12th grade, which is titled.
I haven't read the Wikipedia page, so I'm not sure. But I think, okay, so there was a kind of, I have a guess what this is referring to. So there was, in the city I was from, which is the city of Dresden in Germany, there was a research competition for middle and high school students. So there were different age ranges, but okay, so I'll say high school students now because that was the age range I was competing in. And so they kind of wanted high school students to come up with their independent research projects, and then there was wanted to submit some written materials, and then there was also a presentation. So now the city of Dresden has 500,000 people. So it's not like there's a gigantic amount of people who kind of do really exciting research. So I happened to win the competition, but there were exactly 2 participants in my age range. So the city of Dresden is just not that big. But yeah, so I think what this is referring to is that I at that point did a little research project on my own, but I mean, I wouldn't say this was a real deep theorem. It was more like, I mean, I think it was respectable for a high school student who was working on a project on their own without a mentor, but I think it's kind of, compared to actual research math, I don't think it's kind of significant.
Well, could you talk more about the question itself, since we are talking to other high school students?
Yes. So, okay, so Maybe many of you know what a graph is. So you have vertices and edges. So you have vertices and then you have edges which can connect two vertices. And so let's just assume let's assume that you've heard about it. Is that fair to assume that people know what a graph is? Or shall I
In
explain?
fact, the previous talk was about graphs, so I think.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now there's a concept of a forest in a graph. The forest is a graph which doesn't have any cycles. So basically you can't go around. So a cycle is if you can kind of basically go around. Okay, that's an informal description, but I think it's easiest to stay informal here because I'm not writing anything down. So, so a forest is a thing which doesn't have a graph, which doesn't have a cycle. And so in particular, if I draw a forest, it looks a little bit like, not really, but if you draw it nicely, you can make it look like kind of a bunch of trees in a forest. So that's why it's called a forest. Okay, so so now then there's so that was, so far that's our standard. But so now there's the notion of a hypergraph. So in a hypergraph, an edge doesn't just connect two vertices. So let's go one step back again. So an edge in a graph connects two vertices. So you can formally set it up as a set of two vertices. So then the set of edges would be a set of sets of two vertices. So the collection of all edges would be a collection of sets where each set contains two vertices. So now in a hypergraph, you can do the same thing, but not with two vertices, but with more. So for example, let's just restrict ourselves to a so-called 3 uniform hypergraphs. So that would be hypergraphs where every edge consists of 3 vertices. So now we again have vertices, say a finite set of vertices, and then we have edges, and each edge is a set of 3 vertices, and then we have a collection of these edges. So now one can ask the question, so what should be a forest in this? And so, okay, so I guess you might want to say, okay, it's again something which doesn't have a cycle, but then the question becomes again, well, what's a cycle? And so there exist different notions of cycles in hypergraphs, but they're all very much modeled along this notion of, in a cycle, you kind of have the sequence of edges, which starts with this, then this, then this, then this, then this, and then you go around. And so there are different notions of how to generalize this. There's the so-called loose cycle, the tight cycle, and also some other notions. But okay, so first thing is I didn't know all of these things when I was in high school, but okay, so then if you say a forest is something which doesn't have such a thing, well, that's a reasonable notion for a forest, but you might want to consider other notions too. And so what I did in this project is I proposed an alternative, or kind of, I guess, I think people don't actually consider these hypergraph forests. So I proposed a notion of forest for a hypergraph, and it was defined in a different way. In particular, it kind of, okay, so with what I know now, one can just summarize the content of the project as I showed that notion it has the properties of a so-called matroid. So let me now not explain what a matroid is because that's a bit complicated, but a matroid, so kind of a forests and graphs, or I mean, the set of forests on graphs has so you fix the vertex set, and now the kind of set of all forests, that kind of is a matroid. And so the same sort of thing happens with my hypergraph forest notion. But at that point, I didn't know what a matroid was or that it even existed. So instead, what the project was about was to generalize some theorems for forests and graphs to those hypergraph settings, specifically a theorem of Nash-Williams for decompositions of graphs into forests. So kind of with what I know now, there would have been a much easier way to do this. One can just show that this notion of hypergraph satisfies the properties of a matroid, and then there's a general kind of matroid covering theorem from which you can get these Nash-Williams type results. But I didn't know all of this then. So, okay, so what I explained now is kind of my nowadays view on the project then. For kind of my then view on the project then was kind of, I proposed a notion for forests and hypergraphs and generalized some graph forest theorems for them. So.
Okay. And if some of us here want to do something similar, just look out for problems. Do you have any suggestions?
For problems to do as a high school student, that's really hard. So, I mean, I also don't know whether this was, I mean, I don't think this was a good problem in the sense that I obviously didn't have all the background. I mean, I just told you that at that point, I didn't know what a matroid was. I didn't know kind of about kind of the things that people usually do with hypergraphs. If you have a good mentor who knows all the relevant background, then it can be good to do a research problem in high school. But if you don't have a mentor, I don't think what I was doing was kind of, well, I mean, so useful in the sense that I was lacking all the background. I mean, what I wrote down was correct, but I mean, as I now said, it was an overly complicated proof where with the kind of modern combinatorics machinery, there would have been a much easier way to do this. And
Right.
so it was still a nice exercise, and there was a kind of small local competition in the city of Dresden, which I won, which was nice. But I don't think, I mean, if you are a high school student and you're just on your own, just saying, okay, now I find myself a research problem and then I do research is not necessarily the path to go. And yeah, so if you're lucky enough to have a mentor who can actually find a good project for you and give you all the background and make sure you're on track and not kind of going somewhere off like I did, then I think it can be great. But I also don't think, so I don't think you should feel pressured to have to do research in high school.
Right.
And at least in the US, I feel a lot of people, I think a lot of people feel a lot of pressure to do research in high school to get into college. And I think this is not a great development that people feel this pressure, because for many research problems, or most research problems in nowadays, I mean, research math, it's just unrealistic for a high school student to work on them unless they've taken years of college courses.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's totally fine to kind of just focus on in high school you can either do Olympiads or already learn kind of serious math and kind of that's usually taught at the college level, or do both, whichever you prefer. And then once you start undergrad, if you decide to study math, I think it's also fine to first focus on learning math, learning different areas, and when the time comes, it will be time to do research. And if you happen to do research earlier, that's great, but there shouldn't be any pressure to do so, because also only certain areas are accessible anyway if you do it earlier. And it's good to spend your time learning about different areas of math and get a wide background in math.
Right. So I understand you work in extremal and probabilistic combinatorics. Could you give a layman's explanation of what these are?
Yes, so combinatorics, I guess you all have a pretty good intuition of what it is, because it's actually pretty close to what combinatorics is in the IMO. So usually it's hard to explain to people what combinatorics is, but you all know that already. So now what is extremal combinatorics? So extremal combinatorics asks questions of the form, if you have some sort of combinatorial configuration, say a graph or a collection of sets or things like that, how large or how small can it be under certain conditions? So this sounds very abstract. Let me give a more concrete example. So a very classical theorem in extremal combinatorics, and maybe one of the theorems that started the field something like 100 years ago, is what's called Mantel's theorem. And so there the question is, so suppose you have n vertices for a graph drawn on your paper, but the edges are not specified yet. How many edges can you draw into your graph without creating a triangle? So a triangle would be 3 vertices which are all connected by edges. So now the question is, how many edges can you draw without having a triangle? And if you have n vertices. And so it turns out that for this question, the answer is n squared over 4 rounded down. So there you kind of, there's the theorem of Mantel, which determines the answer exactly. But so this was just an example for kind of the type of question. So you have some sort of restriction and you ask how large or how small can your configuration be? Or, an equivalent way to formulate this would obviously be to say, well, how many edges do you need in order to guarantee that there's a triangle, right? Because now if you have more than these n squared over 4 edges, then you must have a triangle. So there's always kind of 2 ways how to formulate the same thing. But it's always very nice if you can determine the answer exactly, like in this example, it's n squared over 4 rounded down. But for many questions in extremal combinatorics, you can't determine the answer exactly, or at least it would be way too hard. But so what people are mostly interested in is then the sort of behavior the answer has. So for example, for many problems, it's not even known whether it goes like an exponential or like a polynomial, or maybe like a double exponential, or maybe even worse, like a kind of long tower of exponentials, or maybe like a logarithm. I mean, there's kind of, so the first question is always, so what kind of growth behavior does it have? And once you have kind of, say, an answer up to a constant factor or something like that, then you may ask, so what's the correct constant factor? So that's asymptotically kind of correct up to a factor converging to 1. And then you can even run that about lower order terms. But so it really depends on the problem, on what level of precision you are interested in. And so, I mean, basically you're interested in the next level of precision that hasn't been figured out before, but yeah.
So does this overlap with Ramsey theory, or is this?
Yes, so Ramsey theory is kind of basically a sub area of extreme combinatorics, because in Ramsey theory, so maybe not all, did Tim Gowers talk about that, or do we already?
So Tim Gowers' talk was in fact about making triangle-free graphs by removing edges.
I see.
In fact, Jacob Fox's result came up in the talk.
I see.
So you had put a bound on how many edges you need to remove.
Okay, so people don't know yet what Ramsey theory is. That was my question.
No.
Let's say that. Okay, yeah, so Ramsey theory, well, okay, so in general, Ramsey theory describes a kind of area of combinatorics where you talk about how if you have kind of certain combinatorial structures, how you must be, if they're large enough, you must be able to find certain very nicely structured substructures. And often there's some coloring going on. So the most classical Ramsey theory type problems are Ramsey problems for graphs. So there are also other Ramsey problems, but let's restrict for graphs to graphs for now. So the very, very classical result of Ramsey theory is if you have a graph on, say, n vertices, where n is large enough. So, okay, so no, sorry, I should say this differently. So you first fix some number k, okay? So let's say, for example, k equals 10. And now if n is large enough, so large enough with respect to our k, so with respect to the fixed 10, say, then if we take a graph on n vertices, which is a complete graph, so where any two vertices are connected by an edge, so you take n, which is very, very large, and you can take n vertices and connect all of them by edges, but now you color each edge either red or blue, then you must be able to find, if your n is large enough, 10 vertices which are all connected by the same color. That's a maybe somehow surprising result if you've never seen this. There's a very nice proof by induction. Maybe some of you have seen this in your kind of IMO training. Certainly kind of this sort of result is certainly accessible to high school students. But so now the question becomes, how big must this n be? So it's a very classical result that if n is large enough, this is true. And so the best bounds are, okay, so now I should make sure not to embarrass myself. So n certainly grows exponent, how large you need n to be, this bound goes exponential in this k. So this k which we took to be 10, you can ask for any k. And then it goes exponential in k. And I think it's the bounds are something of the form square root, the lower bound is something of the form square root 2 to the k, and the upper bound is something of the form 4 to the k. But if someone knows and I said it wrong, please correct me. But yeah, so kind of this is a big problem in extreme combinatorics to improve upon these bounds, because now we know it's exponential, but we don't know what the correct constant in the base is. And yeah, so there's been a lot of work on improving the bounds a little bit by some lower order terms, but kind of basically the constants are still the same. And so that's extreme. Okay, so this is Ramsey theory, and Ramsey theory, well, it's more than this, but just problems of this type are Ramsey theory, and that can be seen, say, as a sub area of extreme combinatorics. And so now the other question was, what's probabilistic combinatorics? So now this question with Ramsey theory gives a perfect way to bridge to that question, because so now the lower bound for this Ramsey result, where we said we certainly know that we need to take n to be at least or something like square root 2 to the k. That means we can find a graph which has something like square root 2 to the k vertices, and where we draw all edges, it's a complete graph, and where we can find the coloring so that there are no k vertices which are kind of all connected in the same color. But so now you might think, okay, you just need to find the graph, you just write it down. That sounds plausible, but unfortunately, nobody has managed to find such a graph explicitly. And so it was actually Erdős who proved this lower bound, and he showed that if we choose the coloring randomly, then most likely there isn't such a, it suffices with positive probability, but in this case, it turns out to be most likely, there is no coloring. So if you color the edges, so you take your vertices, square root 2 to the k, and now you draw all edges, and now you, for each of them, flip a coin randomly, probability half colored red, half probability half you colored blue, then it turns out that most likely there won't be any k vertices which are all connected by the same color. So you don't know which graph will actually be your example, but you know that an example exists because with positive probability, your random experiment produces it. Right. And so this is kind of really hard to wrap your brain around. How can it be that almost all of the graphs do it, but you can't find one? But I mean, people have tried really, really hard. So this result of Erdős is, I think, more than 50 years old, and basically founded this area of probabilistic combinatorics, where you use probability techniques to solve combinatorics problems. So that's the answer to the question, what's probabilistic combinatorics? But what I was going to say is people have tried really hard to find explicit constructions and failed.
So does this work find applications in other areas of maths, like analysis or algebraic geometry or something?
So there's certainly connections. I wouldn't say there are applications of this sort of stuff to other areas, but the connections maybe go more the other way around, that sometimes in combinatorics you use results from other areas or methods or results from other areas of math, like from algebra or algebraic geometry or analysis. I see. Yeah, so I personally am not so much using analytic methods, but I have used some algebraic geometry methods in my work. And so that's one of the reasons why I would advise everyone to kind of take a wide background of math courses and not just start undergrad, say, oh, I kind of like combinatorics in IMO, so now I want to do combinatorics. I only take combinatorics courses and the minimum requirements and everything else, and try to get to research as fast as possible. That's one strategy, but I think it pays off to also learn a lot about other areas of math.
Right. So looking back, how does being on the IMO Hall of Fame feel? And does that come up like in usual conversations where, yes, I'm on the IMO Hall of Fame, I'm rank 3?
I honestly have to admit, I don't even know the rank by heart. So I guess you told me in the introduction, so now I know. But if you ask me on a random day, I don't think I remember. I know that I was rank 1 once, and then the next year I wasn't anymore, but this is not so important to me that I would always know what correct rank is at kind of, I guess it changes over time. So, and no, it doesn't come up. I also don't consider it important. In the Hall of Fame is also, it's one measure of IMO success, but it's also debatable whether it's the right measure, right? Because it depends very much which country you're from, how hard it is to get on the team, but also how much preparation you get. So now if you're from a country which is very big and very successful at the IMO, so I won't name any specific countries, but you can all think about big countries which always do very well on the IMO, which say always rank in the top 5, then it's obviously much harder to get on the team. So then it's extremely hard to go to IMO 5 times. If you are from Germany, it's much easier to get on the team. It's obviously not trivial, but it's right. Kind of much more doable to make it to the team 5 times. So otherwise, I think the Hall of Fame is obviously very skewed in this way. If you're from some of these very, very successful countries, you are unlikely to make it very high in the Hall of Fame. There are exceptions, but because just it's so hard to get to IMO often enough. But there are some people who kind of have multiple full scores, especially in years where there were not extremely many of those. I think that's in some sense way more impressive than just going a lot. So
okay. Right, so we'll wrap it up. If you have any advice for future generation of mathematicians, can you give it?
oh, that's a great question. I don't think I have any specific advice, but I think it's important. When one is at IMO, I think it's important to, I mean, IMO can be a lot of fun, but one shouldn't take it too seriously in the sense that I guess, I mean, as I said, research math is something very different, and there is no implication either way. Being good at IMO doesn't mean that you have to, that you are going to be good at research math. If you happen to be good at research math later, it doesn't mean that you would have been good at IMO. There are all sorts of combinations, and I think there are two things which can be, I mean, independent of each other. And I enjoyed IMO a lot, and I had a great time, and I hope you're all having a great time too. But so it's probably best once you're done with high school to not take it too seriously anymore. Yeah, that was at least the approach I took, and I think it served me well. So.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Lisa, for being with us. And that was a wonderful session. You gave us a lot of good advice. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience for being present. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.
I think that went well. I'll send you the links to the other talks, right?
Great, that's wonderful.
And hopefully see you sometime soon.
Yeah, and I hope we got through all the questions, but it sounds like we did, right?
We went through most of the questions, yes.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for organizing, and good luck with all the remaining sessions. And
yes.
I think it's great that that you're organizing this, and that the IMO makes such an effort to kind of also provide a virtual program, even though it's obviously difficult to do.
It's very nice, yes. I'll end the meeting. Bye.
Bye.